Hello, and welcome to Rory's Brainworks, where we get creative and see if it works. Today, I will be reading Chapter 1 of my book to you. I had read my prologue previously to you, and now we are on to the actual beginning of the tale. I think I'll be going maybe 5 to 6 chapters deep. I can't read the entire book to you. I'm thinking about doing that on my Patreon, maybe. I don't know. We'll see. I have my reading sweater on, and without further ado, I will enthrall you with a good story. From A Warsinger Opus, A Breaking of Bells, by Rory Thomassen. Chapter 1, Fire Song. Ben would have given anything for a clear sky right now. The dim alley he was running through had ill-laden cobble hindering his step, and waist-high refuse piled against the walls blocking the path. Little light seeped through the clouds, and the young lordling's knee smashed against the crooked edge of a chimney wall, spinning him over. The 2 swords on Ben's hip clattered against the stone. A sour note rang through the narrow path as Ben tried to catch his breath, panting on all fours. Without lies, this wasn't the most awe-inspiring escape. Rain clouds had emerged earlier in the afternoon. Ben was hoping for a nice sunset, not because of the light disparity, but because every Eldowine tale of escape or renewed freedom entwined sunset imagery into their songs. Sure, Cillians didn't have the most robust metaphors at their disposal, but they did know how to set a scene of closure. Ben looked up to the darkened sky and sighed. Well, so much for that. The young lordling turned and chuckled quietly to the shade. Perhaps when I tell the singers this story, I'll just say there was a sunset. Ben looked back to the clouds. A real colorful one. Earth between the cobble was cold and soaked with what Ben hoped was water. His fingers trembled on the dirt and stone as a bitter, rotten smell of wet garbage wafted between the walls. Ben looked behind him where the mouth of the alley started and the busy street had begun. There was no one lurking, but the young lordling felt like he was being hunted. Nervous paranoia was gripping him faster than he anticipated. Despite the peril, there was a song of thrill rising that could not be denied, and Ben had never had so much fun before. The young lordling shook his head of the fire notes within him, drawing in a deep breath to settle his nerves. He had to pay attention to the here and now, focus on the present. There would be a time and place for his excitement, but Ben needed to get to the safe house by the southern escapes first. Leather from his boots scraped on the ground as the young lordling pushed up in a scramble. Trouser linen tore at the knees as Ben scurried back into a run, a smile planted wide across his face. When he reached the edge of the alley, Ben looked around the walls of the city and found the ugly, sharp spires of the church. Good. He was still heading the right way. All the young lordling had to do now was follow the street south from that building while simultaneously avoiding notice by the hundreds of clergy around it. A simple task, really. Unfortunately for Ben, every road in the city led to the church. It was the central hub of Belrose, and Ben didn't know the city streets aside from these main thoroughfares. In fact, he could scarcely remember the map Eilon made him study a few months back. The young lordling knew he had to use these streets as ley lines, but also couldn't remember where each one of them poured out to, just a general direction. So how did one avoid the streets replete with enemies and utilize them at the same time? It's fine, Ben muttered to himself. We got this. If most humans weren't a threat, it would probably make this endeavor way easier, but Eilon always used to say, Navaloch sia balachan, which roughly translates to, no task is without its dangers. Admittedly, the warning sounded better in Vrinlach than the common tongue, but the caution echoed all the same as Ben continued sprinting southward. The streets were packed, alive with folk trying to enjoy their evening, and Ben came crashing out of the alley like a blast of wind through a kitchen window. The young lordling slammed into a group of people and tried to hurriedly shout apologies behind him as he scrambled down the road. Their cross voices rose in Ben's wake, but he was already far enough away that the words were indistinct. The young lordling replaced their shouts with dialogue of his own. Ben's smile turned to a grin, inspired by their words of encouragement. Folk walking ahead looked back to observe the commotion and spread out of the way of the young lordling as he barreled forward. He couldn't proceed like this for much longer. Dipping back into another alley and transferring to another street would minimize the attention he was drawing. As much as he liked their reactions, it would be unwise to continue on like this. Would it make a great story? Of course, but that wasn't the goal right now. Perhaps this time he would consider blending into the crowd on the other side of the next alley. Being inconspicuous was the aim, after all. Ben danced around a few surprised bodies, walking slowly in the front of the next alley mouth. With unnecessary dexterity, Ben dodged the civilians and hunched low, quickly stalking through the twisting spaces between buildings. Ben's heart was a drum, tightly wound and banging to a melody of his chaotic joy. Dark stone walls reverberated the sound, and Ben let the orchestration spur his convictions forwards into a song only he could play. Despite his grace traveling through back streets, Ben exited them unceremoniously, running chest first into another tight cluster of people. The young lordling lost his footing as he wrapped himself in a freshly fallen pile of warm bodies and loose cloth. Tangled, Ben frantically tried to find freedom like a creature from a fisher's net, but a strong hand gripped the back of his arm and pulled him up violently. A beastly man in heavy scaled armor yanked Ben in front of him. Arms ill-fitted and a tight undershirt pulled the young lordling up on his feet. His muscles were tight wires beside his grip. His hooked nose pointed down to a stretched sneer. Crooked brown eyes surveyed his prey methodically. He smelled of sour liquor and sweat, the distinct aroma of a mercenary. "You little ingrate," he barked in a bassy southern-born accent. "Have you no manners, boy? Watch where you're going. Do you want a thrashing?" Ben didn't answer right away. Evidently, this was the wrong thing to do. The man sent a slap to the young lordling, but Ben dodged, instinctually moving his head far enough away to avoid the strike. Not helping his position at all, Ben let out a nervous chuckle as the hand flew by his face. Apparently, that response was incorrect as well. Red crept up the beastly man's neck, veins popping out like gorged worms. Ben recognized the heated emotions of a brute, which sullied the mood a little. The mercenary's nostrils flared, taking in large, deliberate breaths. "I would wipe that stupid grin off your face if I were you," the brutish man explained through his quiet rage. "I don't think you realize the situation you're in now." Ben didn't even realize he was still smiling. It was such a natural state for him that it didn't warrant notice. The burly man's eyes trailed to his side where his fellows in similar armor were helping a portly gentleman from off the ground. A painted lord. Ben hadn't just run into a grouping of well-traveled mercenaries, he had run into a guard detail, a particularly bad situation for most anyone. "You see, Lord Galliford here was in a hurry, and when he finds out who was responsible for making him late to his appointments, he's gonna have me lob off your feet." There was a sickly growing smile on the mercenary's face as he spoke. Ben could count his missing teeth and see the broken veins in his lips. "And I will be happy to oblige the order." The painted lord was pushing the hands off his guards away as they continued to try and get him to his feet. "Gods above and below," the painted lord bellowed. "I can get myself off the ground. I'm not a helpless babe, you fools." Ben snorted at the comment most unwisely. The guard squeezed Ben's arm harder and shook him with a jolt. An angry, perplexed look tugged at the side of the mercenary's face as he looked down to Ben as he snorted. His music was shockingly clear. Ben could almost hear it. The guard thought Benjamin was daft and entirely unaware of the trouble he had just caused. Well, unfortunately for the guard, he knew exactly what was in store. "What in the name of Tellergrand has just happened?" the painted lord asked to his retinue as he dusted off his robes with slaps from his thick hands. "Here, sir," the ornery guard called to his master. "This young menace tried to assault us and impede our lord's fine contributions to the city." Ben could see the red tattoos colored behind the painted lord's ears as he turned around. The other red tattoos across his eyes made his scowl look much more insidious than it would be otherwise. He had only 2 sets of tattoos, but a painted lord with just 1 set was still a handful. "All right, boy," the painted lord began. "Give me one good reason why I don't throttle you right here and... The intimidating words trailed off as he looked at Ben's smile and then up to his eyes. The evening sun was covered and muted, but there was no denying the bright golden stare of a Cillian. "No, go ahead," Ben said calmly. "Finish what you were going to say. I'm curious to know how the threat ends." "Unhand him," the Painted Lord whispered at first, before raising his voice. "Unhand him! Damn it! Unhand him!" Ben was still being solidly held in a grip as the Painted Lord waddled over and began swatting his hands at the burly mercenary's forearms. After a few meager slaps, the man let go of his hold on Ben and moved back as his charge shooed him away. "I'm terribly sorry, my lord," Galliford pleaded. My guardsmen, they're new, from Polea, you see, and they're not yet learned to you and your family." Galliford held his head low and didn't look into Ben's eyes after his initial glance. His hand gingerly went to smoothing out the cloth at Ben's arm where he had been held before he suddenly realized what he was doing. Touching someone of Ben's ilk was crime in of itself. Quickly, the Lord retracted his hand and held it close to his chest with the other. In an instant, the Painted Lord had gone from being a bothered wolf to a shy pup. A crowd had begun to gather. Without lies, the scene could scarcely be ignored. Ben was blending in as much as a splinter. Ben tittered words off hurriedly. "Well then, normally I would love to engage in a clever back and forth, but I actually don't have the time today. Walk into that alley, now." Galliford looked behind him into the connecting alley Ben had planned on going into had the Painted Lord not been in the way. He turned back around with frantic words. "Oh, no! Please don't kill me. If anything, kill my guard. He was the one that harassed you, my lord." The guard sharply raised his eyebrows in response, something between acrimony and terror. "How dare you, you mountain-loving maggot!" Ben shook his hands in front of the two as they began to argue with another. "What? No, I'm not going to kill either of you!" Ben tried to yell in a whisper. "I just wanted to talk in a location more private than the middle of the street." Said street was more of an improvisational amphitheater now, an enthralled mass watching a confusing play rise to a crescendo. I just don't want this interaction reflect poorly on House Galliford," the Painted Lord sweetly stated. "If there is anything—" "Stop your crack-licking," the mercenary interrupted. "No one sells my life under the waves." "How dare you, sir?" the Painted Lord defended. "That was not my intention, and I would have you know that—" "Okay," Ben interjected. "I don't care about any of that. In fact, better idea. I want both of you to pretend this whole confrontation never happened." Both men quieted and exchanged a look that agreed neither wanted to continue trying to sell the other spoiled goods. "I never ran into you. You never threatened me. You didn't sell out your guard. Everything is great. I am going now," Ben continued as he began to slowly back his way into the alley. "That goes for the same of all of you." Ben yelled to the crowd. "I was never here. You never saw me." Ben held up a finger and gave a few seconds to eye down the gathered throng before he spun on his heel and dashed into the shadowed walls of the next alley. "I suppose that could have gone better," Ben said to the swords on his hip. "Wicker and willows. I'm about as inconspicuous as a thunderclap." The young lordling couldn't help but laugh. Nothing was quite going as planned, but somehow that didn't matter. Ben was free. Shaking his head, Benjamin tried to readjust his priorities, readjust the fire song in his essence. The feeling was an encompassing thrill, but that only served to distract him right now. Regaining composure, Ben looked to the tops of the buildings as he came out to another street. The Church of the Faithful was now to his left. All things considered, he was making better time than he thought he would without a horse. It was hard to accurately gauge distance when you watched the city from the heights of reaching towers, but he felt quick. It wouldn't be long yet before he could find relative safety. So, all we have to do now is find the fox's den by the southern escapes, whatever that means, Ben thought out loud. The young lordling usually had barren hallways to talk to in his time of confinement, but now the swords resting on his belts were the proxies he chose as companions. What is so wrong with saying, "Go to the third house on the left from this street"? Everything has to be so cryptic. I know my safety was important, but I'm a man of action, not mystery. Nothing against Eilon, just a little simplicity goes a long way sometimes. Ben casually walked into the street this time, filling in with the rest of the folk, traveling slowly to the southern gates of the city. Ben ruminated on the plan his grandfather had left for him. He tried to remember every last detail of the writing strokes, the ink, the vellum, before he had cast the parchment to the fire as instructed. "Fox's Den by the southern escapes," Ben whispered again. What makes an escape a place? The gates should be anyone's guess, but Ben was taught that in wartime the gates were as defensible as the walls they bridged. Folk called them the immovable portals, as much as an escape as the ground underfoot was. Though, they were always open now. Guarded, but open. A moderate escape, but it wouldn't be that easy, would it? Eilon was more clever than that. The young lordling's new worn, laundered clothes and waxed battle leathers did little to help him blend into the crowd. At least he wasn't causing an immediate ruckus this time. He looked like a painted lord, just without the tattoos and guard detail. He couldn't pass for a knight, looking as clean as he did. No knight with a sword bare to hip ever looked well dressed. Polished battle leathers did little to express prowess in a fight. Most knights Ben had talked to wore armor battered and mended over many times. They looked like they lived in their steel. The more comfortable you looked clad in your gear, the greater your status was among peers. It was no wonder a few eyes from passing faces had looked up to him, trying to figure out where he belonged in the social hierarchy of Belrose. He was out of place. Ben had seen it as well, but he did his best to assimilate all the same. There were deep differences between him and the people around, but the starkest was how straight he held his back. Perhaps it would have been a small detail to a painted lord, but to a common worker, it was as apparent as spending gold for bread. Ben's back had never been burdened by hard labor, a back never burdened by the stress and anxieties of Teller Grand, a back never burdened by the cost of existence. Ben felt soft despite his strengths. The important factor was Ben's awareness of it. The gates opened high in front of the young lordling. He found himself suddenly alone, most folk having moved on from the street to their destinations. At this time of day, there were scant few coming in and out of the great city. "Well," Ben began, "I have no idea where to go." Ben looked down to his swords, which offered no advice, and then back to the sprawling stretch of the walls. "Left or right?" Ben asked the weapons. Down to the right was a caravan of wagons lined with soldiers asking merchants about the wares they had brought to the city. The conversations were quick-worded, short questions with shorter answers. Neither wanted the interaction, but it was a necessary bureaucracy. There were small residences lining the way, but it would be difficult to find the safe house while avoiding detection. To the left was another row of close-stitched houses. A large stable built into the wall opposite dwarfed the buildings. A massive sign jutted out from the wall of the stable with a vivid orange sigil painted on a field of yellow. The logo of the Wagoneers Guild was the most recognizable emblem next to the family crest of Belrose. They were a kingdom of commerce all to their own. Their coffers were stuffed because they advertised themselves in the grandest of ways, going so far as to spreading their business model by paying callers, heralds, and singers to advertise their services. Words as memorable as a family motto rang in Ben's head. An epiphany sparked alert in the young lordling as he said, "To fulfill important dates, hire wagoneers for quick escapes." Ben looked back at the large sign with the colorful emblem and scoffed to himself. Looks like he had found the southern escape after all. Leave it to the old King Eilon to leave clues hidden in a catchy rhyme. "Left it is, then," Ben said as he shifted on his toes and made way to the busy stable. The 3 city entrances hugging the harbor had their own wagoneer weigh stations. Each stable had been built into a burrowed-out section of the outer wall. Ben could see farmland through the wood and horses, but it was a glint of color on the wall next to the establishment that caught the young lordling's attention. There was an extensive mural being painted on the rising wall. Wild animals, Ben had learned from his tutors, danced in rich attire across an open field. Enough vibrant color was being used it bordered on offensive to the eyes. Large beasts and small animals interacted like guests at a ball, socializing or chasing one another in their expensive dress. Their expressions were human-like, as though they had abandoned the nobility of nature for the degradation of city life. The only creature not partaking in the festivities was a long fox, lack of color, walking away from the revelry and out of the picture. "The fox," Ben whispered excitedly. The young lordling approached the pale-painted animal with a skip to his step and took in its form. A bored guest would look the same, leaving a party in silence to slip away in the night, escaping the burdens it could scarcely tolerate. Escaping. Ben did not think himself capable of immediately empathizing with a character so much before. The fox was fading into the stone, sun-bleached despite being newly painted. It was meant to be overlooked. The head was looking away from the crowd and off across the street, eyes seeking a sign of solitude. Ben followed the gaze to a small house squeezed between two others. The dusty stoop made it look abandoned, a relic barely breathing from the first days of Belrose's foundation. Ben tried to not look too obviously interested in the structure as he strode toward it. The door had the ashy gray body of elder birchwood, a tree that took root close to the fringes of the expanse, Cillian territory. A peculiar shape appeared in the grain of the door, the shape of a fox's narrow muzzle and sharp eyes staring back at Ben. It might have been overlooked detail if anything but a Cillian eye was looking. A commotion began to slowly rise off in the distance. Ben lost his focus on the fox and took a step back to better see what was causing the disturbance. "Wicker and willows!" Ben cursed through a breath. If the young lordling had a fear that could yet disturb the success of his quest, it was currently walking down the street not but 100 paces out. The resplendent purple of a Mylan's silken robes shimmered like a painted lord's gemmed ring. Gold trim followed the rare purple and wrapped the Mylan into an intimidating package. People were clamoring to get out of the holy man's way, terrified by their positions of power and what they could do with the notes they wielded. Beyond that, few could endure the eerie, eyeless gaze of a Mylan. The golden veil that covered their head down to their empty sockets was kept in place with a thorny silver crown which looked cocked in Ben's direction. More likely than not, the Mylan's intentions were pointed elsewhere, but Ben's paranoia was on high, and it kicked his mule into walking. Ben threw his back against the door to break the side of the Mylan and started fumbling on his belt pouches for the key he was given. Fingers clumsily unbuttoned openings and probed the knickknacks inside. "Where is it?" Ben thought frantically as he continued to scour his possessions. "Oh, right." Ben reached into a hidden breast pocket beneath his battle leathers. The young lordling had put it there for safekeeping, a place he would remember. Anxiously giggling, Ben tried to unlock the door while he thought about the irony of stowing something so important in a specific place, only to forget it was there when he needed it. Wood slammed inward and the front door hinges screeched as the stress pulled them open. Ben leapt into the safe house and shut the door behind him, engaging the locking latch and running to the other side of the building. A small kitchen had barrels of salted meat and water waiting for the young lordling's use. Stacked boxes of vegetables created a small wall of produce on an uneven table. It was too much food for one person, especially for the 3 days he was meant to stay here, but that was how any affluent child was reared. Ben maneuvered a few chairs and a large chest up to the door before he ran over to the barrels and began pushing them in a line. He started stacking the boxes of produce like the high walls of Belrose. He tried to create as much between him and the door as he could, a line of furniture, supplies, and food. Ben retreated behind the fort he created and waited impatiently. There needed to be as much diverse music between Ben and the Mylan so they couldn't see him. A Mylan's eyeless gaze could pierce the songs of wood, plaster, and stone to the inside of a home beyond. Ben just wasn't sure if they could also penetrate what he had been stacking between him and the door. Ben scrunched up, sitting on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, expecting to hear the Royal Mylan guards knocking down his door. Minutes passed like a boring conversation, and Ben was imagining the worst because he had witnessed it firsthand. The relative silence of a city in motion held sway behind Ben's quick and frequent breaths. When nothing happened after a time, Ben began to feel like he could relax his muscles, but they didn't listen. A Mylan was the hand and voice of gods, not something you could calmly sit with when they were nearby. Ben was smiling all the same. There was danger, a chilling thrill, a lingering threat, but all that meant was Ben was free, escaping into a world he had long awaited to embrace. Nothing was going to get in the way of that, not even the violence of the faithful. Ben tried to smudge these thoughts swirling around in his mind. There had to be a dark place to retreat into in order to avoid notice. Everything made music, but emotions were loudest of all. Without eyes, the Mylan had keen ears to hear the world. Ben tried to put himself into a deep, dark nothing, so he sang no tangible notes. It was against his very essence, but Ben needed to be quiet and still, muted and faint. It was dark before Ben opened his eyes to the room again. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, and the young lordling felt tired in the unlit room. Still, Ben hid himself away, unwilling to drop his guard until he knew he was safe. If it meant being overly careful these next 3 days, then it didn't matter. Ben was finally free. Huddled in the corner of the house, Ben concentrated on breathing slowly, quietly waiting like a tree within a seed. Finally free, smiling at the silent, black unknown. I do truly hope you enjoyed listening to the first chapter of my book. It has been a fantasy epic I've been working on for many years now. I only wish to share it, tell it in grand form, and hopefully inspire a few people along the way. I would be remiss if I did not bring up my other lovely sponsors for today, the wonderful people over at Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rory's Brainworks, just like this YouTube channel. They are my story vanguard, my colonizers of dreams. And without them, these storytelling events would be way harder to accomplish. Thank you for spending your time with me. Be sure to like this video, subscribe to this madness, and comment down below what you thought of my first chapter. I would love to hear from you. As always, I'm Rory. This is my brain. I'm fairly certain it works. Be safe and go create some art.